No mai, haere mai, piki mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So for those who don't know me, my name is Nick Smith, and I have the privilege and honour of being not only the Vice-Chancellor here at Te Herenga Waka, but tonight being able to introduce the inaugural lecture of Professor Susan Ballard. I'd like to welcome colleagues, friends, family, loved ones and supporters. This is a really great celebration. It's an acknowledgement of hopefully not a lifetime of work yet, but certainly an extraordinary career. It's an acknowledgement of a remarkable academic who has brought a whole cornucopia of different influences and provided a way of seeing and a lens that helps us understand the world. Professor Ballard studied first at the University of Otago and Dunedin School of Art. She then received her PhD in art history and theory from the University of New South Wales in Sydney. It was awarded a top 10 PhD from the Leonardo International Society for Arts and Sciences. After finishing her PhD, she then taught on both sides of the Tasman, but also travelled further afield. In 2012, she was the visiting scholar in Korea at the Namjoon Park Art Centre, and then just before COVID, in 2019-2020, she was the visiting scholar at the Rachel Carson Centre for Environmental and Society in Germany. Professor Ballard then joined Te Herenga Waka, and we were delighted that she has both joined us and stayed, but it was in the mid-2020, a period which obviously was associated with the challenges of COVID, and it was also, as it turned out, a difficult period for the art history program at this university. Before I had even arrived at this university, I had already heard of the leadership that she had provided, the way that she had very successfully refreshed the entire art history curriculum, designing and teaching new courses every year. More recently, she's carried on that trend, and she's worked on the development of a new environmental humanities major in both the BA and a new Bachelor of Environment and Society, and has just begun teaching that course in its first trimester. Over her career, she has published 30 journal articles, 6 books, 21 book chapters, 13 exhibition catalogues, and curated 7 exhibitions. Her 2021 book, Art and Nature in the Anthropocene, Planetary Aesthetics, was published by the very prestigious academic publisher Routledge, and was awarded first prize in the Australia-New Zealand Arts, Writing and Publishing Awards in 2022. At this university, she's been director of the art history program from 21 to 22. She's been deputy head of School of English, Film, Theatre, Media Studies and Art History from 22 to 23. And like so many wonderful academics, and I often think this is a wonderful metric for leadership as an academic, she's not only done extraordinary things herself, but she's facilitated opportunities for her students who've gone on to major roles in art and publishing and leadership in the art world. They have curatorial roles in nearly every major art museum and gallery in Aotearoa. And 3 of her PhD students have exhibited at the Venice Biennale. In the undergraduate space, she is an enthusiastic and committed teacher at all levels and has received outstanding feedback from her students. And part of that is because Susan is well known for creating a community, an open space for students and colleagues alike, which allows them to bring their thoughts and work and complex ideas together. It's perhaps no surprise that given an extraordinary array of achievements, that Susan is deeply passionate about the importance of art and art history in our world. She works to create spaces of hope, and I would suggest that spaces of hope today as we stand here are perhaps more important than they've ever been. In conjunction with a recognition of artists in art, in the lecture theatre and beyond. She believes that knowing what images can do and the role that they play in the world is a valuable way for understanding both our past and our future. And as an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersections of art history, creative nonfiction, and environmental humanities, she has made unique contributions. I often ask our inaugural professors if there was something they wanted to share with me as we walk into the room that perhaps humanises what otherwise can be an imposing and for some even austere collection of remarkable achievements. I asked Susan if she had a favourite artist, or a favourite gallery, or a favourite child. She eventually suggested she had a favourite cat. But she promised that I would not reveal that to her two current cats, who are obviously not with us today. But I think it is also important to acknowledge when we look at achievements of our staff, of our professors, of our inaugural professors, that often there is a whole community at home. There's and Susan's family are all sitting here in the front row to my left. And she is open about the fact that her work and her hobby are often the same thing. And that hobby is something which she shares liberally and enthusiastically with her family. And that she's lucky, as she says, that her family have tolerated vacations in art galleries and an enormous amount of walking to go with the art. In this lecture, Professor Ballard will discuss imaging Earth, art and life in a time of crisis. She will reflect on the ways that contemporary artists from Aotearoa and Australia tell stories of local contexts at planetary scales. She will describe how spending time with art informs the politics of life on an increasingly industrialised and colonial Earth. In a time of climate crisis, artists are creating works that surprise us in new ways and help us see the world in those new ways. And for all those reasons, I'd like to welcome Professor Susan Ballard to the stage to deliver what I'm sure will be a wonderful inaugural lecture.
Has everyone got the right room? Earth 101. You can sneak out. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui Nick, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. An inaugural is a beginning, a starting off. But we never begin alone. I wouldn't be beginning this talk without my family who are here tonight. And over the past few weeks, many people have offered me many thoughts on what this lecture means. Thank you, I think. I'm not sure I've managed to follow any of your advice at all. To my colleagues across the 9th floor, who built pathways for me, it was an incredible arrival at a very difficult time. To quote Professor Nikki Hessel from her own inaugural last year, there are no individual achievements. Every word I have written, every exhibition I have made has always been in conversation. One version of this talk was simply a list of all of my collaborators, but it turned out to not be quite so simple, and I carry that list and all of you with me today. And to the art world and my writing friends, my talk today draws on the work of many of the artists and writers I've been lucky enough to work with and alongside, and I do not take these relationships for granted. The commitment to your practice and to a way of being based in reciprocity in an age in which making a living is tied to growth instead of humility and consumption instead of care inspires and informs everything I do. So, let us begin. On the 5th of October 2011, the container ship MV Rena ran aground on Australia reef off the coast of Tauranga. Over the following months, heavy fuel oil and hazardous materials contaminated the marine environment, and many birds, including endangered toro and korora, died. Over 1,000 shipping containers travelled on the ocean currents, many reaching the coast and spilling their contents everywhere: plastic cutlery, masks, and medical supplies. A 5-kilometre-long oil slick slowly washed ashore, coating everything with its foul, toxic sludge. It was Aotearoa's worst environmental disaster. Artists Alex Monteith and Natalie Robertson joined hundreds of people to assist with the massive clean-up on Papamoa Beach. They later returned to Waihi Beach, where containers and debris from the now sunken ship were washed ashore. Monteith's long-form documentary videos of the Defence Force, iwi, and other volunteers capture an eerie glow in the storm-laden sky, reminiscent of a post-apocalyptic movie, echoed in the stark white boiler suits, picked out with flashes of orange high-vis, as people patiently remove tiny buttons of oil from sand and feathers. This is not the classic image of the environment we expect of Aotearoa. Artists tell particular stories of place. They do more than document what they see. They present the whenua as a site of contestation, love, and belonging. Monteith's videos capture a moment where the threads that link Aotearoa to global flows become visible and unexpected planetary connections emerge amidst unspeakable environmental contamination. Situated on the coast, the Rena disaster was both local and planetary. If you asked me what I do all day, I would answer that I write about art. I would tell you that I'm interested in art writing that consciously, carefully, and radically rethinks both what it means to be human and what it means to engage with art objects in the world today. Sometimes I might go a step further and talk about how I think art and writing can help us understand the climate crisis. I'd tell you that I'm scared and worried about the planet, and that spending time with artworks helps me understand some of these emotions. And I'd describe how my writing about art has involved writing about an artist who immersed herself within the deep histories of a river, or writing alongside another artist who spun tales of atua and whakapapa in a barn filled with patiently listening animals. Sometimes our conversation might spiral out to places I could not imagine. Other times it will end with a polite smile as we each drift off to more comfortable locations. Art writing is a form of storytelling through images. As well as giving us worlds beyond the real, the stories we tell through images inform life on this planet. In my view, this is the most vital and necessary form of art history, because through images we can imagine the living earth. This means I work alongside artists who do not simply reflect or represent the world as it is, but imagine it as it can be. But this model of art history as the living story of art is not the one I encountered at university. Last century, do you get that? Art history relied on European models of what an image was and how it behaved. The discipline remained closely tied to Enlightenment notions of class, gender, and influence. We were taught the rules for how to look. There was a canon with one N, and we were instructed to memorise it. The image on the left was in the canon. The image on the right was not. And I failed every single slide test I ever sat. Sorry, Peter. And I quit. I enrolled at art school and gradually returned to art by learning about how artists work with materials. I ground lithography stones during the day and spent my nights exposing paper in the watery cool of the darkroom, marvelling as images appeared. And later, through courses in women's studies and visual culture, I found my people across the sciences, across experimental music and new media. In warehouses filled with sound and shared bodily vibrations, I learnt how to listen. And in galleries and museums, I learnt how to look, not just at art, but at the very apparatus of looking itself. I learnt that art was part of and reflected within the people around me. And slowly, I returned to art history. With these fresh eyes, I was better prepared to write and tell stories that reflected the work of the people I cared about. However, there was another thread that troubled me. Despite the commitment of artists to observing the changing climate, art history remained somewhat oblivious to the emerging disaster. For one, it remained tied to definitions of nature that once again replicated the European philosophies that fueled the exclusions that we pretended we had resolved in the 20th century. I realised that in order to continue to work in art history, I needed to be undisciplined and develop a method of living art history that could draw on the emergent work in the environmental humanities, and I began by challenging the assumptions at the basis of art history itself. And I wrote a book. I wrote a book that sought to address definitions of nature within Western art history. And I developed undergraduate courses that unpacked the connections between art and the environment. My goal with both the book and the courses was to sidestep expected ways of talking about nature in order to take us back into a place of connection and relationship. I was concerned with the emotional toll that this might take on my students. It's not easy to confront both the limitations of your discipline and the collapse of the planet simultaneously. I wanted to make sure that we all felt safe in the classroom. If we learnt to think about art and the environment, if we noticed that all these bodies with which we share the planet are actually relationships formed in the spaces of nature, then perhaps we could enact an art history that was alive. And because of the students who have committed to this conversation, this work is alternately joyful and sobering. Each week, students in my classes propose new ways to talk, think, and respond to the climate crisis. For me, this is what art history and art writing do. They look at artworks again and propose a new view. Rebecca Solnit wrote recently that art can inform, but it has a larger task in the climate crisis, and that is to make us the people we need to be to respond to the crisis in the ways we must. I want to take this suggestion up and test it for the remainder of this talk. Working with the 5 words that make up my title, this is for the 489 students, imagining Earth, art, life, and crisis, let's take this task of the politics of imagination seriously and consider how the art made today might shape both us and the planet's possible futures. So what follows are 5 short stories, reflecting on some of my previous work. Each story contains a collection of artworks that have helped me think about the planet's future. If you like, you can count them off. There's 5. And we can have a little shakedown in between. Each in their own way attempts to answer this question of how art can make us into people who can respond to crisis in the ways we must. So number 1, crisis. What I didn't say was that we're doing it backwards. So in 2019, I was living in Wollongong in the Illawarra and working with geographer Christine Erickson to gather artworks that contained a record of alliances between fire, plants, and people. This was our shorthand. We wanted to see if our respective disciplines, human geography and art history, could work together to tell a story of resilience and recovery after the devastation of the bushfires. Could art help us understand how some people could pick up the pieces after unimaginable crisis? We found stories. While waiting in a remote area, rural firefighter Sharon Field would paint tiny observations in the bush as it smouldered. We visited collections, where curators and collection managers pulled out images from the stacks, as interested as us in what we might find. And I learned through Christine to read the bushfire's path and understand that relationships with fire were relationships overwritten with colonisation. We learnt how regrowth, watching and seeing the bright green shoots of life that emerged the days after a fire, enabled people to imagine a new future. But as we were finishing the book, we found ourselves living the story of the book. We had sent the final manuscript to the publishers in September 2019 and began work on image permissions. And then it all became very real. New South Wales was on fire. By December 2019, I was really unsure about what we should do. Could we publish a book about living with fire and recovery when so much was being destroyed around us? On the day that my PhD student Sandy Lockwood was interviewed in The Guardian, having just lost her studio for the second time, I said, we cannot go on. Christine said, people need stories in order to know what to do next. So we went on. This astonishing photograph, taken just 2 hours south of Wollongong, is an image that recalls works like Signorelli's fresco of the damned cast into hell from 500 years ago. And yet it was real. Here's Jude Ray's painting of the photograph, made even more real by its call to Neville Shute's dystopian Australian novel On the Beach. The bushfires were not contained before the COVID-19 pandemic arrived. And in early 2020, Christine was appointed to a position in Switzerland, advising the European Union on wildfire preparation. And 6 months later, when the borders opened, I moved here to Aotearoa, masked up, following the contaminated air, sitting uncomfortably with it all. In one of those rare moments between lockdowns, Alicia Frankovich captured my lingering discomfort in a performance staged at the Auckland Art Gallery. The work consists of a large transparent orange box that echoes the orange smoke-filled sky that had filled our lungs and drifted over Aotearoa. AQI stands for Air Quality Index, a marker of how much damage simply breathing air full of particulates might do. Inside the box, 6 performers engage in surviving. It's clearly a hostile environment. The people have just a few clothes, backpacks, a torch, a small boat, and their water bottles. So art is not simply representational. It does not simply document the world around. Similarly, the experience of crisis is not linear. As one thing happens, we refer back to previous events in order to make sense of them. As I've said, a living art history helps us to observe. It works by telling stories of looking. In an age of catastrophic change, is this enough? Frankovich and Ray do not just represent my experience of the fires, they make me feel it over again. They work because they are familiar images. We have somehow seen them before. You can shake now. While in Wollongong, I worked with a group of artists and writers to establish a research centre for critical and creative responses to climate change. We shared a sense that if we were going to be able to contribute to the kinds of work that the scientists were asking us to make, we needed to upskill real fast. With modest funding, we met on country at Bundanon and began to develop collaborative methodologies for teaching and research in the new field of environmental humanities. During the day, we swapped resources, creating a shared language for talking about art and literature in the Anthropocene and at night we sat and watched the wombats trundling around and talked about how to imagine the future. Agnieszka Golda began to carve a menagerie of animals on the edge of extinction. This bushstone curlew perched on its lump of concrete contained our desire for small moments of hope. Its borrowed anime eyes reflect knowledge of other birds from other times and draws us towards an uncanny place where imagination rules. Inspired by Agnieszka's vitalist and planetary poetics, I began to write a series of essays that combined the field of extinction studies and art history. I turned to Aotearoa, the last large habitable landmass to be colonised by humans, and the most recent to experience a major extinction event. I had included Hayden Fowler's video installation, New World Order, in an exhibition titled Among the Machines that sought to trace the impact of settler pastoralism on Te Waipunamu, and it offered a path. For New World Order, Hayden built a post-extinction, post-utopian forest, its shapes inspired by fairy tales in which humans are lost, encounter magic, and are transformed. This dull grey landscape is populated with pedigree mutations. This guy's my favourite. Hayden gifts these exotic birds new techno voices that they use to call to one another. In the constant activity, they are living amidst the ruins, but this is their home, and they offer us a story of survival. And 3 years ago, I began an ongoing project with Sophie Thorne, whose eye I haven't caught yet. Hiding. To bring some of the practices of the environmental humanities to Ngā Puipui o Te Haringa Waka. Sophie and I shuffled around thumbnails, reaching for something different, a sensation that would open up the situated knowledges housed within the collection works. We thought about natural histories and human histories converging, and the central role of art in telling these stories. We discussed the material ecologies of the planet and artists whose work we admired, and wanted to fold into the conversation. When I had worked with musician Rachel Shearer on her PhD thesis, we had spent time listening to the planet. In her thesis, Rachel wrote, "If we listen closely, we hear not only different frequencies of vibrations, but also the whakapapa of ideas and spaces resonant with them." Rachel identified connections between Te Ao Māori and European frameworks that themselves embraced vitalist rather than rationalist tendencies. It was this vital resonance of people and planet that Sophie and I wanted to bring to the gallery. For Listening Stones, Jumping Rocks, we installed Rachel's work in the dark of the Kirk Gallery, from which a deep shimmering karanga flowed out, wrapping around the edges of Len Lai's universe and becoming a fog encircling the birds from Sorowit Songsatai's interior. Connections were being made by the works themselves. The interior is a gathering of birds, extinct and endemic, cast and carved, and at the work's centre, the moa, a glowing, vital being. Through working on this show with Sophie, I learned that exhibition practices open spaces where stories can be told between artworks, where art history becomes living, shared and felt. Listening Stones, Jumping Rocks was not really about rocks or birds. It was about how the spaces of a gallery might reach out to the ideas and sensations resonant within the environment. In revisiting these works tonight, I'm struck by the second half of Solnit's phrase, "the ways we must." It's an instruction to us, her readers, but it also opens up a problem of inclusion and exclusion. Who is she thinking about? Who is we? In 2015, the Anthropocene Working Group defined the Anthropocene as a geologic epoch in which our species has left marks or traces on the Earth's surface. I'm quoting them, by the way, there's quotes here. And we have become geologic or geophysical agents. Again, this shorthand, we. Yes, some humans have fundamentally changed the operating system of the planet, erasing the lives of many species and transforming water, soil, climate, and atmosphere. However, these impacts are uneven. Controversially, in 2024, the International Union of Geological Scientists overturned the work of the working group, rejecting the naming. This is an update for everyone who did Aotearoa a couple of years ago. Rejecting the naming of the Anthropocene as a geological epoch, noting, however, and this is really important, they say, it remains an invaluable descriptor in human-environment interactions. In doing so, they open the space for the humanities, for us to pick up the concept of the Anthropocene and to put it to work. And to work with concepts, feminist philosopher Elizabeth Gross says, is how we create radical change. Gross explains that concepts are not themselves solutions, but are tools to identify and address a pressing problem. As a concept, then, the Anthropocene addresses the pressing problem of climate change. And once named, we can begin to assess it and open up the question of who is invited to the table and who is being instructed to act. For example, Angela Tiatia's Holding On is a work that uses a direct visual allegory to address the pressing problem of sea level rise, coastal erosion and extinction. Tiatia lies on a concrete platform off the island of Tuvalu as she is buffeted by the rising tide. The sun sets, the tide rises, softly at first, and gradually, with more urgency, she works to hold on to land and stay safe. The light fades, and she struggles to catch a breath. Her fingers grip at the edges of the platform, but there is very little to grasp. All at once, we sense the islands and the people and the ecological crises that are being experienced here. All at once, we understand that the ocean that gives life now has a different kind of relationship with the people who depend on it for life. Even the water itself has transformed. The International Ocean Portal team note that the Pacific is now 30% more acidic, a change faster than any other known change in ocean chemistry in the last 50 million years. In 1952, US biologist Rachel Carson captured the beginnings of this change in ocean chemistry in her book, The Edge of the Sea. Accompanied by exquisite pencil illustrations by Robert Hines, The Edge of the Sea is a meditation on life in the intertidal zone. Carson frequently slips from detailed biological description to wonder. Her work prefigures and opens up the concept of the Anthropocene to planetary and allegorical relationships beyond the human. In 2019, as Nick said, I was lucky enough to have a visiting fellowship at the Rachel Carson Centre for Environment and Society in Munich. I wanted to know what the pressing problem of the Anthropocene looked like from Europe. I hadn't been there. However, while I was there, I realised that the European notion of the planetary was stuck in the 1970s, a great blue marble. This Anthropocene did not feel pressing. It felt distant, controlled, contained, and not connected to material experience. And this bit's for the photography nerds in the room. But this cropped and rotated image is not the photograph or image as it was taken. This is the original image taken by the Apollo 17 crew in 1972. The image matters. Antarctica is at the top, and the universe is beyond. Paying attention to the whole frame, this unfamiliar orientation unsettles the Enlightenment apparatus of mapping that structures the globe into north and south. We are back at the edge of Carson's rock pool and back on the concrete platform with Aotearoa. On the far horizon is the invisible edge of the deep subduction zone named the Mariana Trench, where once dragons lived. And I'm making these leaps because what I learnt in Europe was that if the concept of the Anthropocene is to be useful, it also needs to consider the planet as a body that is visual, imagined, allegorical, and mineral. And situated within the Mariana Trench, Joyce Campbell's flight dream captures everything: the dragons, the acidic water, and the wondrous rock pool, as we witness the beautiful slow-motion suspense of a series of objects immersed within an electrochemical bath. We listen to a monotoned narrator describing a journey deep within the trench in search of a monster, a creature that possesses neither name nor form. Everything begins to corrode and eventually dissolve. With their two very different forms of allegorical and planetary immersion, Campbell and Aotearoa's works open up the politics of sensation to the pressing problem of the Anthropocene. You following me? So, geological and human histories and bodies overlap because they have always overlapped. Wedged at the base of our skull is the petrous, the densest bone in our bodies, housing the components of the inner ear. As another of my PhD students, Heini Amanos, presents it here at scale, it is a vessel for hearing, for geo-thinking. We are made from stone-like matter. After returning home from Munich, I began to wonder what the deep art histories of this planetary body might look like. And I began to write short fictions in relation to the artworks, and one of them goes like this. Everything on the planet is 4.54 billion years old, give or take 50 million years, as Moss will tell me. All of the energy that is stored within each rock, stone, hair follicle has been here since the start of the universe. This is not true. Everything on the planet is a fraction of a second old. Individual quarks are dancing around, reforming themselves into new pairings, new matter, new energy. At any moment, we are leaking atmospheric gases and gaining material from meteorites. Our bodies are materials formed from the planet. We are geological subjects. In my hand is a bronze cast of an ancient petrified tree. The cast has two surfaces. As I spin it around, one side reveals the other, and time is remade. I'm standing in a studio in the Illawarra with the artist Bianca Hester. This is Dharawal country, formed through the relationships between geologies and whales, sea and salt, and ancestors who have lived here for over 60,000 years. The object in our hand has two surfaces. On one side is the echo shape of the colified, fossilised Glostoporus wood that occurs in hundreds of fragments distributed along the rockfalls and landslips present along the intertidal zone of the Illawarra. This is a cast not of a mark left behind, but of the body of the tree itself, fossilised between 200 and 250 million years ago. The Glostoporus species was the dominant species of the Gondwanan forests that stood in the area. At some point in its life, this tree saw fire, and its kin contributed to one of the richest coal seams in Australia. As we spin the bronze object around, on the second side is the surface of a plant fossil from the Middle Triassic era after the extinction event of a plant called Spinobaria sectina. Its leaves resemble the charred remains that floated down off the escarpment during the 2019-2020 bushfires. But this is a fossil held in the collection of the Australian Museum. It was first archived within the Geologies of the Planet and then archived within a human archive, the museum. Forever clasped together and warmed by our touch, two sides fold time across millennia. To think alongside the rocks and stones means enacting new relationships with time. The pebble we casually pick up from the beach and put in our pocket will have witnessed environmental transformations for thousands, if not millions of years. Bianca reminds us of the need to maintain relationships with the temporal histories of the earth in order to have conversations with our future selves. These works remind us of something we have seen and felt before. In suggesting that we need to undiscipline art history in order to generate a living art history, I'm not suggesting we get rid of art history. No. In fact, I'm arguing the opposite. Knowing our history is powerful. In the same way, we cannot get rid of geology. Both geology and art history emerged within the structures of European thought at the same time. Both have an inhuman politics. Both arrived in Aotearoa together, carrying enormous baggage. In the early 2000s, I worked with a research group called the Three Ecologies Network. The goal was to imagine radical futures where our work could have impacts outside the university. After a long discussion one day, the Canadian philosopher Brian Masumi declared, "Hope is not a useful affect." Hope, he argued, was always pushed into the future, never focused on the now. We needed something else. At the time, I politely agreed. And yet today, I have changed my mind. Instead, I think that hope is about orientating ourselves towards the future and welcoming it, extending the future some hospitality. Welcoming hope means that wherever we look, whether at a rock pool or an artwork, we are immersed in seeing and feeling the planet. Think about Yuki Kihara's portraits made in the aftermath of Cyclone Evan, which hit Samoa in 2012. The artist, in the guise of her biblically inspired alter ego Salome, is shown from behind. She is gazing out to sea, her head and shoulders positioned just above the horizon line, the composition and costuming evoking German Romanticism, images of wanderers amongst fog. Kihara brings these histories with her in order to challenge the colonial forces of environmental transformation. While Kihara's photograph is a response to a particular disaster, it invites us, as viewers, to extend the scale of the crisis it witnesses in space as well as in time. It helps us think about our place on the planet. It works because it is a familiar image. We have somehow seen it before. But I need to be careful with the stories I tell. Not every story belongs to everyone. Even if the concept of the Anthropocene is a useful concept to describe the pressing problems of colonisation and capitalism, it impacts every one of us differently. In Aotearoa, being tangata tiriti means being accountable to this difference. It means challenging the exclusions of language and the assumption that we are all in this together. Sometimes it means ditching we and being specific to place and individual experience. In our second exhibition for the Adam Art Gallery, Folded Memory, Sophie and I imagined the way that a taonga totara had witnessed nearly 500 years of shifting social, political, and environmental atmospheres in Aotearoa. We realised we needed to imagine these histories otherwise. We sought out works that could rebalance the weight. We folded together narratives of resistance that offered anti-colonial modes of imagining and inhabiting the planet. We opened the spaces of the exhibition so that they too unfolded to histories that had remained within the archive, the sea walls and remnant forest of the exhibition. Our aim was to prompt a change within the experience of the gallery, to open the door to things we had not seen before. So that was 5 short stories. And the genre of this lecture, and perhaps all academic work, firstly requires, I think, an undisciplined practice. They were certainly undisciplined stories to uncover the omissions and exclusions of history. But secondly, I think, we need to think about how we extend a welcome to the future. And this is the work that is done in collaboration, in classrooms, and in art galleries. It is the work of a living art history and the work of imagining the earth. In my art and environment course, we begin with the Industrial Revolution in England, and we read John Ruskin's description of the setting sun and the coming tempest, all the while wondering why he never mentions the drowned and shackled legs floating in the front of the painting. We spend time looking at the painting and imagining the horror it contains. Turner was well aware of the story within the painting. He wanted us to pay attention, and yet somehow we forgot to look closely, caught up in the seductions of paint. Indian author Amitav Ghosh writes that the climate crisis is a crisis of culture and thus of imagination. Imagination helps us to pay attention to what is right here in front of us. And this is where artists and writers do something that scientists and journalists cannot. Like the journey we've taken this evening, artists make associations: planet, rock pool, molten iron, fire, tsunami, monsters, seed pod, marble, air canal, palm, oil, coal, seed, bark, and remnant forest are placed together in a way that shifts how we feel and what we might see. These works give us new language and new sensations. Think back to Alex Monteith's videos of the MV Rena catastrophe. The event they document remains terribly familiar. Oil does not simply disappear. Just last year, we witnessed another similar catastrophe unfolding on the coast of Samoa. Across Te Moana Kiwa, waves that once carried tall white boats now bring new kinds of planetary energies, and the animals, shells, plants, and corals that witnessed centuries of transformation are once again rendered vulnerable. We need scientists to measure this. We need the environmental humanities to remind us of it, and we need the artists to ask the hard questions that we haven't even thought of yet. So in this talk, I've shared 5 short stories in response to Rebecca Solnit's question: how does art make us into people who can respond to crisis in the ways we must? The tools of visual description that I've used tonight and are at the core of any living art history are about noticing, reciprocity, and relationships. To take responsibility in the ways we must, we need to think about ourselves as people who pay attention to the planet. So bear with me, it's week 2. Embracing some of the ways of working that are being explored right now in EHUM 101, I'm going to ask you to try this act of responsibility out now. I want you to shut your eyes and imagine a tree. Perhaps it's one you know well, a tree that you have spent time with, or perhaps it's a painting or a photograph of a tree. Perhaps you are creating it right now in your mind. Pay attention to the structure of the branches, the way they divide and the way the leaves spread. Perhaps they catch the late afternoon light. Or perhaps yours is a morning tree, warming itself in the first rays of the sun. Think about its companions, other trees, or the non-human animals, birds, bugs, and fungi that surround it. Breathe it all in. You've just created an image. You're allowed to open your eyes. It's your tree, but you do not own it. It does not belong to you. Hold it with you, though, as you leave the room tonight. Artists have an incredible ability to help us imagine a world of possibilities beyond those laid down by colonial and capitalist violence. In turning materials into sensation, they open up the possibility of new formations. We connect to each other through their work, which means that as we imagine life on Earth, we must tell each other stories of what we see, because there is, after all, a politics to imagination. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa.
You've just done my job. Congratulations, well done. Thank you so much. So, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Aotearoa Coxhead toko ingoa, ko Taranaki Aho. As Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, it's my honour and privilege to propose a vote of thanks for our colleague, Professor Susan Ballard, to celebrate her and give thanks for her wonderful inaugural lecture. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Sue for her talent, energy, efforts, knowledge and skills which she brought to Te Herenga Waka 5 years ago. Sue gives us a lot to think about and is committed as professor to opening up space for others to contribute and take part in academic and artistic endeavours, but more on that soon. I want to acknowledge the Vice-Chancellor, senior leaders in the university, colleagues from the 9th floor of the Von Zedlitz, or Von Bublitz, which is what I call it, and beyond, the Adam Art Gallery, Sue's parents, Keith, who used to work here in this very building, used to boil the jug from time to time, I've heard, and Pat, Nathan, her partner, Moss and Charlie, her kids, who are on screen right now and in person, Art World colleagues, including folks from Enjoy, Te Papa and City Gallery. And of course, it's important to also acknowledge Sue's students and patrons. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us this evening. During this inaugural lecture, Imagining Earth, Art, Life in a Time of Crisis, backwards, I was listening, we've had the privilege of listening to Sue's personal journey of noticing, sitting with, gathering, tracking and challenging assumptions. She provided a narrative of 5 journeys, which she told me last week started as a rant to hold the art world to account, but has since turned into a love letter. Sue has given us a valuable and timely reminder of how vitally important art and writing are, how art makes things happen, helps us reflect on the past to make sense of the now, and ultimately supports us to respond in times of ecological crisis. I had the opportunity and good fortune to read through Sue's speech for this evening and to speak with her about it last week. Immediately afterwards, and with her permission, I connected her to our Sustainability Director, who earlier in the week had laid a gentle but firm challenge about how research in creative arts, humanities and social sciences could possibly make an impact on climate change. As she said tonight, art writing consciously, carefully and radically rethinks what it means to be human. Sue's work helps us respond more fluently and confidently to questions such as what the importance of art and writing might be in relation to critical human and environmental issues such as climate change. Art and writing help us imagine the future, as Sue has so carefully, eloquently and passionately shared with us this evening. In her environmental humanities classes, week 2. Sue works with students from across the disciplines to think about environmental questions and responses to them. These responses are not just scientific. They have cultural and attitudinal origins which are embodied in art and language, and we all need to be able to interpret and understand them to create change in our behaviours. I've just quoted you there in our talk. Professor Sarah Ross, head of school, noted that with Sue we got a 2 for 1. With art, history and environmental humanities, it's probably more like a 3, 4 or 5 for 1 with Sue's expertise, passion and cross-disciplinary approaches. Your research, Sue, fills the spaces of and in between art, history and environmental humanities, opening up exciting possibilities for the future. You reach far and wide across disciplines and collaborate broadly. Your teaching leads the next generation forward to find new ways of seeing and being, empowering students with skills and tools to build relationships of care and concern, and thus giving them confidence to step into an unknown future and use art to inform the politics of life. Sarah Ross, again calling on your words, Sarah, just one highlight of Sue's, your pedagogical vision is to establish the Aotearoa and Melvin Day Fellowship in Art History, which brings a New Zealand art historian to the program for 4 months and undertake research, teach a special topic, and then provide access to an exciting times with outstanding researchers in the field, allowing students to experience specialisation and expertise. It's a wonderful vision for the future. Professor Sue Ballard excels in so many ways. She frequently shares that she loves her students. This is obviously reciprocated with repeated and overwhelming feedback from them. Sue publishes articles and books, curates exhibition. You've seen it all tonight. Her passion shines so brightly, and her wisdom and energy and wicked sense of humour, I'm quoting Sarah Ross here, makes her a much treasured colleague. Sue commented to me that Te Herenga Waka felt like an impenetrable space to her 5 years ago. You've already helped break down some of the walls in your discipline of art history, Sue. You move people out of comfort zones through making them have art diaries and helping them see in new ways. It's a very great pleasure to have you knocking down some metaphorical walls on the 9th floor in the university, in our city and in Aotearoa, and to have you helping us begin imagining our future. This is a moment of celebration for all of us, and it's a total joy for me to offer this vote of thanks here today. I'd like to welcome you afterwards, after the thunderous applause, which we're going to repeat, to join us in the Hunter Common Room through those doors for some refreshments. But first of all, I'd like you to all share in showing gratitude and great celebration for Professor Susan Ballard here with me today. Thank you.